Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
You are watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear, here as always alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, as always, great to be back alongside you.
It's always great to be alongside you, Eugene.
Well, I'd say the pleasure is all mine, and of course, shout out to everyone out there in viewer land, or maybe listener, if you're doing something as you listen to us talk here. Shout out to you as well. And of course, we have a great show for you, as we always do, which is why this is a great time to remind you to go ahead and hit the subscribe button, then hit the bell so you can get the alerts for the things that you have subscribed to, because in addition to this show, we've got all sorts of great content coming out, including Dispatches with Rania Khalek, which has already had some great stuff this week, live with our good friend Ali from Electronic Intifada. Very, very highly recommend you check that bad boy out. But of course, everything, the new movie coming out, The Teacher, excellent movie regarding the struggle of the Palestinian people. So a lot of good stuff from Rania Khalek Dispatches. So you would know all about this if you had hit subscribe and hit the bell. Some of you already do. So that's a reason for you to do it, of course. So happy to say that as well. If you happen to be watching us on Free Speech TV, you don't need to do anything but keep watching FSTV and keep supporting all the shows and all the work that's happening there. And a big shout out to the FSTV team, as always, for making it possible for us to appear there as well. Rania, are there other things you would like our viewers to know as we get ready to get started here?
Yes, Eugene, I want to remind everybody that we are an independent media outlet and we are able to sustain ourselves with support from you because we don't take money from Lockheed Martin or from the big pharmaceutical companies, or from Wall Street, or from Silicon Valley. That's what makes us independent. So you can help support Breakthrough News at a crucial time when we're just like flooded with a tsunami of corporate-funded media that lies about everything by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News. And for as little as $5 a month, you can become a member of Breakthrough News and access exclusive content as well as exclusive merch. And also, you know, Eugene, I just want to say I have watched your episode with Brian Becker on the Socialist Program that was out yesterday twice because it was so good. All
Thank
about
you.
the trade war, the tariffs, like really excellent. You provided so much historical context, so much important analysis that's missing. You're not going to find that kind of analysis anywhere else. So it's reasons like that you should become a member of Breakthrough News at patreon.com/Breakthrough News so we can keep bringing you that sharp, independent analysis from the left.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. You know, it's been quite a week as it concerns tariffs, which we'll talk about a little bit later on here today with Ashok Kumar, but also had the opportunity to do the China report with Amanda Yee, a little tighter focused on tariffs, so not as broad ranging, but also some interesting conversation. So we've got more coming. Kay Pritzker, who you may know from Breakthrough News, working on a video. So if you care about what's happening with the tariffs, there's no one who's got you covered better than Breakthrough News. And of course, we're covering as many things as we can of note around the world. So we're getting ready to start on that journey. So great opportunity for you to let people know that we are here. We are going. Text them, call them, pass a note, you know, whatever seems right. Air horn, foghorn, carrier pigeon, you know, something. I don't know. Screen printing. I don't even know what a screen print would do, but I'm just trying to say.
Eugene, don't send people to do things that's just gonna waste everyone's time.
Well, I'm assuming that the only people who are going to do screen printing might actually like have a screen printer where they're watching the show. But
that's true.
Shout out to the bag makers of the world. Let's just go ahead and get started on that note. We want to turn to South Korea, where quite a bit has been happening, with quite a bit in the news. You may have missed it. The impeachment of President Yoon did take place. He was impeached, and now there is a presidential campaign on and a lot of different implications on all of these things. So we are very, very honored to be joined on the show once again by Joo-hyun Park, who is a member of Notatol and also the engagement editor at The Real News. Joo-hyun, as always, thanks so much for joining us.
Eugene, Rania, good to be back. Thanks for having me.
The first thing I want to ask you, now that Yoon has been impeached, is how big is this really? I mean, it was such a major event for him to attempt to establish martial law, and the Korean people did not accept that, and here he's now out of office. I mean, where do you place this in terms of significance?
I mean, it's tremendously significant. What we're seeing here, I think, is a very important moment in terms of the history of South Korea, in terms of the history of popular struggle. President Yoon declared martial law back on December 3rd, and the Constitutional Court ruling, which unanimously upheld his impeachment and dismissed him from office, was on April 4th. So that is a 4-month-long struggle in which it is now estimated more than 10 million people in South Korea, so about a fifth of the entire country, participated in this popular struggle in some form. Over the course of roughly 120 days, you had 67 days of mobilization. This was a struggle that united vast sectors of society, from the students to organized industrial workers to debt-ridden farmers. You had queer and LGBTQ organizations out there in the streets representing their own interests. You had demands coming forward from irregularized workers who are being exploited by what in Korea is termed platform monopolies. So, these are companies that are kind of Uber-esque or like a DoorDash in terms of their business model. So this was really a very broad popular struggle that was primarily being engaged in by the working class. It is part of, the kind of long road of democratic popular struggle that has taken place in South Korea over the past several decades. And President Yoon is the fourth head of state that has been removed from a popular struggle in South Korea since the founding of the Republic of Korea back in 1948. So this is, I think, not a moment to understate the importance of what has developed and what has gone on. At the same time, it's a time when the struggle is not necessarily over. The fascist forces that were in support of President Yoon are still out there. They are still part of the government in many respects. And of course, there is a movement that backed him as well, and at various times looked as if it could potentially contest for power in the street with the mass progressive movement that was demanding President Yoon's removal from office. So the political struggle in many ways has only just begun, and it is only going to continue in the coming months and years, particularly with the upcoming special election, which will need to take place by June 3rd.
Julian, I'm curious if you could maybe elaborate a bit when you talk about this movement. What are the broader demands of such a movement, and how are people in South Korea, after a lot of this upheaval, envisioning a deeper transformation towards a kind of real democracy?
That's a great question, Rania. So I think the narrative that we've received overseas has really been emphasizing this as an institutional process where the National Assembly stopped the initial declaration of martial law, and now it's the Constitutional Court that has removed President Yoon from office. Now, of course, procedurally, all these things are true, but I think what we need to understand is that the undercurrent of that and what really gave this movement teeth was the fact that it was mass in character, that it had broad commitment from millions of people who were willing to do things like mobilize in the middle of the night under threat of martial law in the initial declaration, who were willing to continue mobilizing and organizing through the bitter Korean winter. You had people that were sleeping on the streets of Seoul in the thousands under aluminum blankets and freezing temperatures in order to assure that their demands were met and that the movement was being kept alive and momentum sustained. Now, what was all this for? It was for a lot more, actually, than just the removal of President Yoon from office, although that was, of course, the immediate demand. Underlying this movement has been the framework of total social transformation or total social reform. And what is meant by that is really a broad-based platform of progressive demands that have been pushed by organizations and social movements in South Korea for years, if not decades. It includes things like upholding and expanding labor laws to apply to the roughly 50% of South Korean workers who are irregularized and therefore considered outside the scope of protection by labor laws in South Korea. It includes demands for gender equality, both in the workplace and in the society. It includes the protection of the rights of LGBTQ people, special kinds of provisions considering the debt problems that are faced by many farmers. Once again, as I mentioned before, this was a broad-based movement. It brought together many sectors of society, and we saw those demands reflected throughout the process of the of the mass movement and its struggle to remove Yoon. And, I would add to that that, in addition, there were also a number of demands, and, there was politicization occurring around the question as well around US military bases, US military war games in South Korea. Freedom Shield, one of the largest war games on earth, took place during the heat of this popular mobilization in the middle of March. And so I think, all of that was coming together under a common framework and a vision being pushed by millions of people for really a more just and inclusive and democratic society in South Korea.
And I think it brings me to my next question is how much do you think some of these demands and some of this zeitgeist, if you will be captured in the presidential election campaign? I mean, I know Mr. Lee and the Democratic Party are heavily tipped to perhaps win, and he's raised some issues, I know, around social inequality and different pieces like that. I mean, what's your expectation there in terms of how the presidential campaign will or will not, or maybe we don't know, channel or, embrace some of the energy that's been coming from the street?
I think if the current opposition and Lee Jae-myung are smart, they will recognize the importance of being able to uphold and advance the demands that are coming forward from the mass movement. At the same time, in many ways, we have been in a similar situation before. I mentioned earlier that President Yoon is now the fourth South Korean head of state to be removed through a popular struggle. The most recent incidence of that was less than 10 years ago when President Park Geun-hye was removed in what is now called the Candlelight Revolution or the Candlelight Movement, which looked very similar to what has occurred in the struggle against Yoon in terms of the role of a mass popular movement. Now, at the same time, a lot of the demands of that Candlelight Movement did not truly translate into governance once the opposition came into power. That was particularly true for questions concerning the conditions of the working class, and ensuring that the power of the corporate monopolies that really do run South Korea are broken and limited in significant ways. So I think it is both incumbent on the political parties in South Korea to honor the will of the people and to be willing to fight as champions of the people, and simultaneously the mass movement has to continue organizing and asserting its power in order to be able to push its agenda on its own.
I have to ask also, how is, if at all, any of this being impacted by the new administration in the U.S. with Donald Trump in office again? And I mean, maybe this speaks to like the broader situation happening around the globe, because obviously Trump is instituting policies that are impacting especially the global economy right now.
Absolutely. I think, it's a very interesting time to be paying attention to South Korean progressive media in particular. There is conversation that I am seeing there in terms of, key scholars, thinkers, just vocally saying, like, we probably need to prepare for a world without the United States, or where the United States is no longer, in the position that it has been over roughly the past century. And I think that, the Trump administration is doing a lot to create a lot of unease within South Korea. And that's on multiple fronts. There's the question of tariffs, which really are targeting South Korean industry. We have to bear in mind that South Korea was industrialized in many ways to the benefit of the US ruling class, to the US capitalist class, not to the US working class, because of course, that did result in industries being moved overseas. But when we want to understand why this massive wave of industrialization took place in South Korea and other parts of East Asia in the mid 20th century, it's because it was to the benefit of Wall Street. Now, the ruling class in the United States is in a position where they are starting to say, okay, we want some of those jobs to come back possibly, or at least we want the industries to return. They're talking about this in terms of steel, in terms of automakers, to a certain degree in terms of tech as well. And all of that is going to have a massive impact on the South Korean economy. I think that is something that is really an X factor that we'll have to be looking to this year. South Korea has already been looking at some pretty dire economic years, both as a result of tariffs under Biden and, of course, the political upheaval that was created by Yoon's attempted coup over the last few months. So I think that all of that is going to deeply impact the US-South Korea relationship, although just exactly how is something that remains to be seen. I think, other factors to bear in mind are Trump's sort of airsats overtures for diplomacy and dialogue with the DPRK or North Korea. This is something that the administration was being very vocal about when they came into office. We're not hearing as much from them about it any longer. And I think that, in the meantime, what we're seeing is a lot of the consistent trends carrying over from the Biden administration into this new Trump administration in the form of expanded war games in Korea, in the form of increased military aggression, a push to form a new trilateral alliance between South Korea, Japan, and the United States, which is really a building block towards building out an architecture towards something like NATO in East Asia. So all of these factors are going to apply pressure at different points in the US-South Korea relationship. Exactly how things will play out, how the rubber will meet the road, so to speak, is I think something that only time can tell. But it is definitely a very interesting time to be looking at the relationship between the two countries, and a time when I think that we will see many tensions possibly bubbling up to the surface in ways that we have not before.
No, absolutely. This might be a bit of a stretch to connect it, but we're talking about the struggle for democracy, and we're talking about the relationship between U.S. and South Korea. I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the case of Yoon Seo-chung, who, of course, is being targeted by the Trump administration for her own Palestine activism, and, of course, having her immigration status criminalized in that regard. And it feels connected to me in some way, even if maybe people say I'm off base, when we're sort of looking at the nature of how the overall struggle is developing, here in the United States around democracy and what that means about the relationship to U.S. imperialism and people's ability to criticize it. And I know you all have been working on this issue at Nadya, and I know, in fact, you all were very supportive of what was happening in the Palestine movement from the very beginning, and have been educating people about the connections between Korea and Palestine and the United States as well. So any thoughts you wanted to offer there?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for those of you who are in New York listening to this, I would really urge you to come out on Saturday to the People's Forum at 2:00 p.m., where we'll be hosting a town hall for Yoon Seo-chung. We'll be hearing from her legal team. We'll have a Know Your Rights training. We'll be talking more about her case and what we can do in order to fight as New Yorkers to not just defend Yoon Seo, but all of our students, really. It's about Mahmoud, it's about Rumesa, everyone that's being targeted by ICE in this administration in this moment. I think, Eugene, I understand why you sort of set up that question in a way where we want to maybe not be too forthcoming by saying it's all connected, but I actually want to insist that it actually is really all connected, in that you can't have democracies coexist with imperialism, right? The moment your society begins to democratically undertake a genocide, that democracy in your society has died. So I think that, those are definitely really strong links that we should be making. I think that a lot of people in the United States and around the world have looked to the movement in South Korea, have been taking some inspiration from it over the years. I think there are a lot of lessons to learn in terms of the consistency, the persistence, the organization that people have demonstrated. And if we want to effectively struggle for democratic rights in other places, we need to take those lessons and apply them, of course, doing so within our specific conditions. And, I think to just say a little bit more about Yoon Seo herself, this is someone I haven't personally met. This is a 21-year-old Columbia student who is now being hunted by the Trump administration for her participation in a mass global movement for Palestine, which I think we all know was truly the right thing to do in terms of the eyes of history. And I think just one thing that we should all be taking time to say right now is how proud we are of Yoon Seo and every single student, every single person that has sacrificed and borne risk for the sake of fighting a genocide. That's what we need to be doing in this time, right? We can't struggle for democratic rights in one corner and then refuse to fight empire on the other. We can't say that we want due process out of one side of our mouth, but then remain silent in the face of a genocide, right? We need to be engaged in a totalizing struggle for justice. And I think that drawing those links is actually quite important for us to be doing right now, because this is not a struggle we're engaging in isolation as students or as Koreans or as Palestinians or what have you. This is a people's struggle for our future. And that's the way we need to be approaching it and thinking about it and talking about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Joo-hyun, it's always a pleasure to have you here to sort through all these various different things. Joo-hyun Park, member of Nadya and engagement editor at The Real News. As always, thank you so much for some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much. See you later.
Rania?
Well, Eugene, lots going on, and there's so many regions of the world that we have to get to, as we always do on this show. But there's something I forgot to say in the beginning.
Yes.
I forgot to remind everybody to smash that like button.
Smash
it
that
helps boost
like
us.
button.
There it is. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It helps boost us in the algorithm. And make sure you're subscribed to Breakthrough News, and make sure you share this, as Eugene said earlier, with anybody, anybody and everybody. And I just want to apologize in advance for fogginess today, which is my tonight, because I just got back to Lebanon, and that jet lag, from west to east is brutal, Eugene.
It is.
Brutal.
It is. We hadn't noticed anything yet, though, so you kind of told on yourself.
Well, I just want to say it because I feel like it's going to be noticeable, because I'm not at my sharpest the first couple days after I get back because of this brutal jet lag. You just can't get to sleep at night. It's so hard. Body's adjusting. It's a 7-hour time difference. It's insane.
It is. It is. Well, we appreciate you soldiering on through here, but we'll do our best to move through the show, judiciously, so that way. Ooh, excuse me. I don't know what's happening. You mentioned that you're fit. Now I'm getting sick. This is something happening here. But we want to get you out of here.
Are you blaming your sneeze on me? Are you blaming your sneeze on me?
I am, yes.
Wow.
Someone has to be responsible.
That seems unfounded.
It's a karma kind of thing, maybe.
The sympathy pains. You're having sympathy pains with your co-host.
Let's turn to Ukraine. Ongoing conflict there.
Other part of the world?
Yeah. A lot happening. Ukraine, Russia, America. There is actually a lot happening. It just feels like almost everything has been washed out due to tariffs in the past week or so. There's massive news happening in basically every corner of the globe. But obviously the U.S. and Russia continue to have these sort of off and on negotiations. Ukraine continues to do whatever Ukraine is doing. European countries, of course, massively rearming. So a lot happening vis-a-vis Ukraine that has big ripple effects around the world, potentially quite dangerous ones. So we are very, very honored to be joined here once again on the show by Mazda Majidi, who is a political analyst and organizer with the Answer Coalition. Mazda, thanks so much for being back with us.
Hi, Eugene. Thanks. It's great to be here.
Great to have you with us. And I guess, sort of maybe speaking a little bit to my intro here, I was hoping we could start with a little bit of an update on where things are in the war, because of course, just before all the negotiations with Trump started, the media was filled with Russia's winning. But now that the negotiations are happening, I feel like the actual status of what's happening on the ground has kind of fallen out of the stories, and it's all just about people, meeting in this or that place.
You're right, Eugene. I think with any negotiations, you really have to use as your starting point an observation of what's happening on the battlefield. Overall, and this is important, something like 20%, 1/5 of the area of Ukraine is now under Russian control. Just a couple of days ago, Newsweek published this article heavily emphasizing the fact that Russia's advances have slowed down. And they had numbers. They were saying in November 2024, Russia took 700 square kilometers. In December, it went down to 400. And elsewhere, the British Foreign Ministry published a number saying that in March of 25, Russia had taken over only 143 square kilometers. Now, that may well be true in terms of slowing down, but the fact remains that Russia continues to make advances, and that's a significant point when we're dealing with the approach that Zelensky and the Ukrainian ruling class is taking with regards to this. Another point that's important to people who were following the news is in August of 24, Ukraine went into the Kursk region in Russia, which was a surprise attack, and it militarily didn't make any sense to anybody. And Kursk, of course, is a region that's known to those people who are familiar with the history of the Eastern Front in World War II. That's the scene of the greatest tank battle in history where the Red Army defeated the Nazis. But that incursion into Russian soil, which was pretty deep, was eventually pushed back, which could also explain why Russian advances elsewhere haven't been as much as before. But one of the things that even Zelensky pointed out is that Russia is planning for a spring offensive in the Kharkiv region and Sunni regions. Excuse me. So overall, as we're looking at the negotiations and the possibilities for agreements and understandings, we have to keep in mind that things are not going well for Ukraine, and the fact, and this has been an ongoing problem, it's becoming harder and harder for Ukraine to keep soldiers on the front. A lot of young people who are called up refuse to go. Some leave the battlefront for lack of any support. A lot of them are losing many of their comrades and so forth. So on the battlefront, things are not going well, and it is likely that with the spring offensive, things will get even worse for Ukraine.
I'm curious if you could tell us, Mazda, with these U.S.-Russia peace talks stalled and European nations, as Eugene mentioned in the beginning, rearming, they're also considering troop deployments, increased military aid. What's driving this divide between the U.S. and Europe, and why is the U.S. advocating for peace now, while Europe appears to be the one favoring escalation, which is sort of like backwards in how it started? Or perhaps that's not the correct framing.
No, Rania, I think that is currently the framing that reflects the reality on the ground. I mean, one of the things that we have to keep in mind, despite this image that the European imperialists have like to present of themselves of being, cultured and civilized and all this kind of stuff, they're just as much imperialist as the U.S. In some instances, at least in the last 70, 80 years, they've been less adventurous than the U.S. But when it comes to the rush to take over a territory and take over an area's resources and markets, they're just as aggressive as the U.S. And, the whole issue of Ukraine and Russia, as little as this is covered in the Western media, and particularly in the corporate media in the U.S., Russia has legitimate concerns. And the concern is that the European imperialists, the French, the Germans, the British, may not just want to bring Ukraine into their orbit, but Russia itself, which offers them vast resources and so forth. The Europeans would very much like to end the days of Putin and bring back elements like Boris Yeltsin, who put a for sale sign on everything. And, this is something with the continued eastward expansion of NATO that is very concerning. And the other thing that's almost never covered in the U.S. media is essentially the coup that overthrew the Ukrainian president in 2012 and led to different developments that that it's happening now. And Zelensky and so forth. There were agreements, Minsk I and Minsk II, that had to do with the eastern region of Ukraine, where the majority of the population is Russian. And there was, Ukraine had committed to, prior to Zelensky's time, had committed to observing an autonomy, limited autonomy for those regions. And Ukraine has reneged on that for the last 7, 8 years and so forth. So from the European perspective, the perspective of European imperialists, they would very much like to completely integrate Ukraine into their orbit if they haven't already. And if they can impose a humiliating defeat on Russia, then there's a good chance that they can overthrow or sideline Putin and his grouping in the Russian leadership, and the prize would be Russia and all of its vast land and resources. For the U.S., it's different. Much of the U.S. ruling class still wants to support Zelensky, but of course the Trump grouping now wants to limit that, and that's a whole different discussion as far as what Trump's motivations are and so forth. But I'll just say this. If you look at the dismantling of Yugoslavia by the imperialists, led by the US, but also the British, the French, the Germans, and so forth, most of the gains of those went to the European banks and corporations. So again, European imperialist states are no humanitarian entities.
Yeah, no, great point, and I think an important one, given, as you say, the way they try to make themselves appear, especially vis-a-vis Donald Trump now, who's so rude, crude, and boorish. It's easy for anyone to to shade themselves in a positive direction. But I wanted to speak to the point you just made about Donald Trump's motivations, because of course, this is one of the main things that's held out by his supporters and himself about how he's all for peace. I mean, amazingly, they even said this morning they're all for peace with China, which, okay, fine. But, peace, peace, peace. But Ukraine is the centerpiece of that because it's so different than what we had seen from the bipartisan consensus, since the invasion of Ukraine. So, I mean, maybe it's obvious here, but is he a peace president? Is this a sign that he loves peace, or is there something else going on here?
Well, Trump is different from as we all know, different from the typical ruling class politician. Most ruling class politicians are essentially trained through a long period of the different interests of various banks and corporations and so forth. Trump is in part motivated by his personal ego and his petty battles with this or that. So the starting point with Ukraine and how he diverged from the majority of the U.S. ruling establishment is how, in the lead up to the 2024 elections, he called Zelensky and asked him to dig up dirt on Hunter Biden, who had business dealings there. But also, I think we have to look at another component of that, and that is that from the imperialist perspective, much of the ultra-aggressive approach towards Russia is not all that rational. Now, granted that generally speaking, imperialist policies are determined by their strategic interest and so forth. But when it came to the Cold War, the opposition of the US and the European imperialists to the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc was obvious. The motivation was, socialism is a dangerous thing to capitalism, and you have to use every method to try to overthrow socialism. When it comes to Russia, I think much of the reason why Russia is in many instances on the polar opposite side of the Europeans and the US is how they've pushed Russia to that corner, and how instead of accepting Russia into the European Union, they just wanted Russia to be their source of raw materials. They wanted to convert Russia to a completely third world oppressed country, and that didn't work. Now, it is true that I think Trump and some of the people in his administration, and this goes beyond Trump, there's been this view among imperialist ideologues that the opposition to this level to Russia doesn't even make sense. And there's a lot of resources, lots and lots of resources that the US and the Europeans have poured into this war that Ukraine is fighting against Russia, that from their perspective should be mostly directed towards the more important battle with China, which is socialist and which is very much a rising superpower. And from the imperialist perspective, a much more serious threat to their interests than Russia is.
Maza, I'm curious if I could bring in one more thing here, since we're talking about negotiations and war and peace. As I'm sure you're following, there are these negotiations that will be taking place with Iran on Sunday, indirectly through the Omanis. And Trump has been talking about potential war if Iran doesn't capitulate, but also that he really, really wants to make a deal. He just met with Netanyahu, which was a bizarre sort of press conference that included some Iran talk. And, Netanyahu, we know, is really, really would love for the U.S. to just destroy Iran and regime change it. But there do seem to be a few contradictions there. So obviously we'll know more after Sunday. But I'm just curious your general thoughts, as it seems like we are closer than before to a potential war with Iran. And we also have a very different region we're dealing with now, where what was known as the resistance axis is significantly weaker than it was a year ago, 2 years ago.
Well, Rania, I think, we kind of have to emphasize that the reality of negotiations with Iran is likely not to produce any agreements. With any negotiations, you have to look at not the diplomatic skills of the individual politicians involved and so forth, but what each side is willing or able to give as concessions. And while since Trump went into office, uh, at least in Iran and for much of the U.S. media, they've been talk about negotiations and deals and so forth. I haven't seen anything from either side that indicates that any agreement is possible. The Trump administration wants essentially Iran to capitulate on all fronts. End your nuclear program and any support for Hamas, for Hezbollah, for resistance, for Yemen, for resistance to Zionism and imperialism in the region, and then we'll talk. And of course, the Islamic Republic of Iran, to its very core, has existed in support of this region, despite its many, many internal contradictions and so forth. It is not a possibility for Iran to give up on all of those things. At the same time that I don't think a real peace is possible, despite all the media attention it's getting, I don't think an escalation of war is possible either. I mean, Trump is doing his normal thing of talking big and hoping to intimidate the opposing side into capitulating. But in this case, that's not going to happen. But the reality is that for the same reason, even much more so than the last 20 plus years, as much as the US would like to overthrow Iran, there's no possibility for it to do that without paying, a heavy, heavy expense in terms of the retaliation that Iran can put out, not just against Israel, but for the U.S. bases and the U.S. client states in the region. Iran is not 2003 Iraq. Iran has a lot of capabilities to defend itself, and the tens of thousands of missiles and rockets that it has buried deep in the ground that people may have seen the clips of indicates that it's not going to be an easy thing. So Trump can talk big and hope that an agreement can be reached. But in that sense, it's similar to what Trump has done with the Ukraine, thinking that if he just started talking big, people would be forced to make an agreement. And still, the contradictions that underlie that battle and the contradictions that underlie the confrontation between the U.S. and Iran are still in existence. And that's not something that can be talked away. So I would say I'm not too hopeful in any meaningful agreement, and I'm not too fearful under the current circumstances of a U.S. bombing of Iran.
Mm-hmm. Well, from Eastern Europe to West Asia, this is why we always like to invite you on. Mazda Majidi, thank you so much. You're an organizer with the Answer Coalition. Really appreciate you joining us and helping us sort through it all.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Mm-hmm. Rania?
Well, Eugene, I mean... Here we go. Just so much. It's crazy because, I know you did the socialist program with Brian Becker yesterday, which I want to plug that again because really I actually listened to it twice. It was so good. But I know you messaged me afterwards and you were like, wow, we just recorded the socialist program and already the news has changed.
Yeah, literally 5 minutes after we stopped talking, the 90-day pause came in. And so immediately I started freaking out. And then I said, oh, well, they're keeping 10% tariffs on everyone. So we're still relevant. We're still in the game. But I mean, it really is. So you're right. It's like literally every 5 minutes you have no idea.
And it's like a ping pong ball around the world. Like right now, the last few days, it's a tariff issue. Next, it's going to be who knows what. Like before that, and all these things are still going on at the same time. By the way, it's the ICE detentions, the student visa revocations, Gaza, just endless. Like it doesn't stop. And so I think there's something to this administration. And you and I were talking about this when I was in New York, because I was telling you this is really overwhelming, keeping up with all this news. And then you mentioned something about the rise of Hitler and Mussolini and how there was a similar sort of overwhelming theatrical, just nonstop flow of insane news.
Well, yes, and we're going to talk about some of that in an upcoming episode of Dispatches. So I'm not going to
Yes,
say
we are.
one more
Sorry,
thing
I
about
forgot.
that.
I forgot what show this is.
No, it's okay. I just don't. I don't want people to get too much of a preview. I want them to have to get behind that paywall to get that last 30 minutes. But we were able to talk a little bit about the tariffs. It's a great segue with Ashok Kumar, the professor of political economy in the UK. He had a lot going on today, but very graciously earlier today was able to pre-record an interview between him and I, talking more about the tariffs and some around it. So we want to go ahead and play that now. Well, as Trump's tariff chaos is continuing, we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show by Ashok Kumar, who is an associate professor of political economy at Birkbeck University of London. Ashok, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's an honor to have you here, and I have to say, the second Trump's first chart came out on reciprocal tariffs, and I know now we're moving things around, but I immediately thought of your book, Monopsony Capital, because seeing China, Bangladesh, Vietnam, all of these Southeast Asian countries, I was thinking so much of, your thesis there about the increased leverage for workers in a world where these U.S. supply chains were becoming more and more reliant on just a few producers. And I wonder to what extent you feel this, potential rise in worker power, at least potential worker power, and maybe more solidified supply chains that aren't as easily manipulated by global North countries are playing into the policies here and the thoughts.
Well, there's a few things, right? So very early on when, the system of globalization as we know it came into being, really, I think after the crisis of the 1970s, it was a system built for the benefit of large capital holding countries and the capitalists and corporations that were within those countries, so namely the US. So the entire system was basically built for them. So when Trump prioritizes talking about trade deficits, that doesn't really matter because the entire system is built to be traded in dollars, highly financialized, disintegrated, meaning, there's very powerful buyers and not so powerful sellers in the global South. So it was a completely asymmetrical system. By hyper-focusing on this kind of trade deficit is sort of, missing the point. The point is the entire system, whether it's a trade deficit or a trade surplus, ultimately feeds the imperial core and benefits the global North countries primarily. We see that sort of changing in 2005, 2006, when primarily driven by China, the consolidation in China, the development in China, it sort of changes the dynamics quite dramatically. So now you have, Trump's rolled out in the last hour that, today that China is going to have 145% tariffs. China is 84% tariffs on U.S. goods. And what that is actually in 10% across the board is trying to, it's a geopolitical tactic to try and roll out a kind of new Cold War to put pressure on China. The fact is that China has been prepared for this for at least the last 30, 40 years. That's why you have a diversification of their trade regime. They're hegemonic trade partners in many countries in Latin America, 54 countries in Africa, across Southeast Asia. They have the Belt and Road Initiative that embeds Chinese capital and investment across over 100 countries. And they've done, debt relief in over 70 countries in Africa. And the loans that they give out are between 3% and 4%, which is the same percentage that the U.S. loaned to Germany and Japan and Italy after World War II, part of the Marshall Plan. So it's a much different program than the U.S. has and had. And so what you'll see is not what the U.S. is expecting, which is countries abandoning China, which, China has 0% tariffs for most African countries and Latin American countries, but countries moving closer to China because there's an economic incentive to move closer to China.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, I was reading an article in the Chinese media a couple months ago that said if America isn't careful, they'll move themselves into regional party stature in terms of the regional power status in terms of the overall global order. And it seems like that's the case. And I guess I want your thoughts about whether, and I think maybe it's implied, but just to pull it out a little bit more, the possibility of this actually creating more jobs in the United States. I mean, this is, of course, how it's being sold by Trump, but it just doesn't seem like the dynamics are there for that possibility of, tens of millions of jobs or something coming back the way he's presenting it.
Look, if you're a capitalist and you're trying to start a factory in a country, the thing that you want most is stability. But you also need, built up infrastructure in America that's deteriorating. You need, workforces that are, invested in terms of, their education, etc. Concentration of workers. All of the dynamics that you need, but you also need stability. So a tariff regime that you don't know it's going to exist in 10 years, 5 years. What you had in China and why companies were investing in China, especially in the Pearl River Delta region, was because they said, we have a 5-year plan, we have a 10-year plan, we have a 20-year plan that tells you that we're going to have this much stability. It makes sense to invest here. In the US, it doesn't make sense why a company would invest. I mean, maybe some companies that are secondary units, so like automobile companies, they might go to a supplier in Mexico. Those suppliers may invest in the US, or Foxconn, which produces exclusively for Apple. They may stop moving goods from China, where they're primarily based, and they also have facilities in Indonesia and South India and Brazil, and they have one facility in Wisconsin, so they might invest more in that Wisconsin facility to expand it. So you might see elements of that, but when most products, even that are made in America, 90% of the supply chain will be outside America, the effect will be an enormous cost to consumers. And I mean, this isn't a radical position. This is the position that of anybody with any economic understanding. There's no other way there's no other direction of travel. And this is something that, Trump has really been committed to this anti-tariff position since the 80s, when it was a kind of left-wing position. And now it's not necessarily a left-wing or right-wing position. It's just objectively the case that unless the state is investing in factories, which I don't see that happening anytime soon, capitalists are hugely disincentivized from investing in the US because of the volatility.
I think that's a really good point. And I mean, I think it speaks to a deeper question, too, about how we really build worker power, capitalism versus socialism, because I feel like so much of the conversation, at least here in the United States, is, you have to have tariffs if you want to have a strong working class. There's no way to actually expand the economy unless it's a beggar thy neighbor type policy, pitting workers here against workers in the global South. It's all, South Carolina versus, Sri Lanka or whatever it may be. But it seems like for like the working class, that is not really the standpoint to be looking at these sort of global geopolitical issues.
Look, there's two things that go here. We can't have a kind of writ large argument about workers, because right now, even if companies move to the US, they'll have huge tax incentives to do it, and the wages will be depressed. And there is some incentive necessary to expand in the US, and obviously those conditions might be better than, say, somewhere in Latin America. But the difference is about sector. So if you look at the garment sector, those factory jobs coming to the US won't necessarily increase wages and mean better conditions. But if they say had targeted tariffs for the steel industry, that would benefit steel workers, because then they're not necessarily competing with other places, and they're not as movable. So for example, in Britain, the fact that you've had these tariffs means that the steel industry is sort of going bankrupt. That's been privatized. Now the national government is talking about renationalizing it, right? They were talking about this yesterday. I don't know if that'll happen. That's a positive development. So renationalization is a positive development. What it means for workers' power, in certain sectors, it could increase workers' power because you have limited options for capitalists to undercut their wages. But in other sectors, it may not do that, because what it might mean is workers are also consumers. So, the price of goods going up, the asset prices falling, inflation being run away, that has a negative impact on workers, especially if it doesn't lead to more investment in the real economy, which it doesn't seem like it will.
I'm glad you brought up the issue of the UK and policy there, because it seems like the UK and, of course, the EU is not exactly the same thing, of course, but are at sort of an inflection point here vis-a-vis their own relationships with China and the United States and others, of, whether they're going to try to, find a way to get along with Trump, or whether or not they, too, will embrace, working more collaboratively with China and other nations in the global South to, I don't know if isolate the U.S. is the right word, but at least to find a way to sort of get around this attempt to throw up a bunch of tariff walls.
That's one of the benefits, I think, of this tariffs. I mean, especially people who are more critical of the global order. Right now, you have an imperial bloc, which is Western countries, Europe, the US, Canada. This imperial bloc has geopolitical consequences. It has those consequences, say, in Ukraine, in the Middle East, potentially in the South China Sea with Taiwan. So geopolitically, a fissure between the imperial bloc, Europe, Canada, Australia, and the US has only positive outcomes, because if the US is trying to build a coalition to go bomb another country, it can't do it as easily. So they don't have that kind of hegemony to do that. The secondary point is that it has a much more interpersonal. Across Europe, they're boycotting goods from America. Canada, they're boycotting goods. This is a net positive because the U.S. has a hegemonic hold. So I think China is reaching out for all evidence points to them reaching out to Europe, and Europe might be in more and more economic pressure if China says, okay, we'll have no tariffs, and the U.S. is saying we'll have 10% tariffs. Increasingly, parts of Europe may try to move closer to China, especially as it becomes less in their interest to be this kind of imperial bloc.
No, I think it's a good point, and just a couple more questions I want to ask you here. I mean, I wonder also how you think it could rebound on South Asia. I mean, it seems obviously, there's an attempt to kind of, India 29%, now China, 130% and counting, all these different pieces to sort of pit the different giants of South and East Asia against each other. But it also feels they have a lot of incentive to collaborate in this context. But obviously, India has its own, motivations, as does Pakistan and other countries, vis-a-vis how they relate to the United States. So I wonder how you see, insofar as we can see, this affecting the overall dance, if you will, between China and India around this, the concept of both countries rising or attempting to.
Well, look, Pakistan has historically been allied to the U.S. I mean, Imran Khan came in and tried to switch that. Now he's in a prison. So we don't know where that's going to go. In India, obviously, it's been 10, 11 years of the far-right government of Modi. Even though you would assume that they would become closer with the Americans, they actually have much closer ties with Russia. As Russia becomes closer to the U.S., that might also change that dynamic. And that, the jury's still out about that. With China, India fought 3 wars with China. They historically have had quite an antagonistic relationship with their border nation, but increasingly they've had increasing talks about over contested land. So those talks might lead to more stronger bilateral relations. So all of this is sort of up in the air. It's hard to know where India will fit in here. India's it's not a clear cut. It still has elements of that sort of non-aligned movement where they're not clearly with Washington, they're not clearly with Moscow, they're seeing where they can get the best probably trade agreement. So it's hard to say right now.
Mm-hmm. And just finally, real quick, Israel obviously had tariffs put against them by Trump. Netanyahu couldn't get them lifted, but we're seeing more, their investment going into Israel is obviously going down because, they're waging this genocide and people don't know if it's a good investment. I mean, could there be some geoeconomic aspects to how, the sort of the strength of the Israeli apartheid project that could, come into play here in terms of the overall relationship of forces in West Asia, because so much of their economic model and the way it's integrated in with the West seems like it's also getting caught in some of these headwinds?
There's a few things here. So some of the arguments that people have said, why from the left, that people are saying, oh, Trump is doing this is to prevent de-dollarization. But the de-dollarization prevention argument doesn't make any sense because it's not targeted. So like you said, 17% for Israel, 10% for Iran. Obviously, they've now flattened that out to 10%. So that argument doesn't really make any sense. But what you see is the economy in the U.S. going down, weakening their relationships with other countries and allies, weakening. If we understand Israel as a proxy of the U.S., effectively a military base in the middle of piercing at a critical choke point, the African nations from the Asian countries, then the weakening of its imperial power and the economic power of the West and the strengthening of China. I mean, China doesn't have a hostile relationship with Israel, but they have a much more favorable relationship with Palestine. They've had all the factions meet in Beijing, the Palestinian factions. They had, they negotiated the peace agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, Syria under Assad and the Saudi Arabia. So they have a much more peaceful relationship to the Middle East. They're not as hostile or antagonistic as we'd like them to be with Israel, but they certainly are a much better, have a much better relationship to the Middle East. So the weakening of the U.S., the weakening of the imperial powers, the weakening of the U.S. economy, all potentially allows for a weakening potentially of Israel. So it's really, again, this is, they've now flattened it out. Iran has 10%, Israel has 10%. There's obviously lots of disinvestment that's happening in Israel. There's also been a brain drain recently. There was an article that talked about the brain drain that's happening in Israel. You also have the Yemen forces Red Sea blockade that's having a negative effect, 20% increase costs for prices for any goods in Israel because it takes 2 weeks longer to go around the Horn of Africa. You also, just recently, New York Times 4 days ago did an article about that the U.S. ballistic missiles and precision missile stockpiles are emptying because they're bombing Yemen so much. But the Pentagon anonymously officials said that they're being completely ineffectual. So the blockade is being quite effective. So all of these combination of forces, both meta forces and specific forces, could be putting medium, short-term pressure on Israel and hopefully longer-term pressure to really try and dent that economy.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of different factors, a lot going on, and we really appreciate you being willing to join us here to help sort through it all amidst the chaos. Ashok Kumar, thank you so much for some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rania?
That was an excellent interview. Well done.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And big shout out to Ashok. I know he had a really busy day, but was really willing to fit us in and to work that out. And I thought it was a great interview, great insights. And I hope, especially vis-a-vis that last question, he is correct that the overall weakening of the United States economy will also help weaken Israel more. That would certainly, that's my editorial commentary there.
Unbelievable. A month of zero aid allowed into Gaza for a month.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Yeah. I know.
We're just starving them.
And amazingly, the foreign minister said there is no shortages. And it just, what? We've just entered this parallel universe where when it concerns Israel, you can literally say anything you want and it can be as fake as possible. And no one other than the, billions of us around the world who are screaming into the void will actually raise it. But, we're not the New York Times. We're not Financial Times. We're not these other people, who are, of course, reporting on how there's no aid going in, but do not, call these officials out as liars. Anyway.
Well, there was, so last weekend.
Yes. Good segue. Thank you.
Both of us were in D.C.
You're sharp.
For
You're sharp.
the rally.
You were trying to lull us into a false sense of security there earlier.
Well, I feel like if I lower the expectations, if I tell everybody my brain's foggy from jet lag, they'll be like, oh, poor Rania. And then when I say something that's relatively coherent, they'll be impressed. That's how you got to do it, guys. That's how I got to where I am now. But both of us were in D.C. last weekend for the March for Palestine. It was very well attended. There was, tens of thousands of people. It was said to have been bigger than the protest against Netanyahu when he visited D.C. last July, which you got pepper sprayed at, covering that protest. But there was lots of people there. It was good to see so many people come out because, I think the impact of this genocide is obviously to exterminate Palestinians and make room for more settlers, right? To expand the Israeli settler state's territory. And also this constant horrific violence is meant to make us numb. And I think the Israelis thought that after doing it for this long, people would just stop caring. So people have not stopped caring. In fact, there's been almost like a reignition of the movement in a way because of the ways in which this administration has brought it home to the U.S. in terms of these acts of repression. Obviously, a big centerpiece of the march last week, Eugene, as you know, was demanding the release of people like Mahmoud Khalil and other students who've had their visas revoked and have been put into ICE detention. And the U.S. is attempting to deport them. In the case of Mahmoud Khalil, he has a green card still sitting in ICE detention. It's just unbelievable what's taken place. And we call Palestine the canary in the coal mine for a reason, because they're not just revoking the student visas of people who participated in protests last year on college campuses against the genocide in Gaza, but they used that to justify it in the beginning. And so people didn't push back. And by people, I mean institutional power didn't push back, because when it comes to Palestine, they don't care. Mm-hmm. And so now you see it happening to hundreds of students across the country. And anyway, I also saw, I'm just giving you kind of my general thoughts. I also saw last week that there was a parallel protest organized by, I think, some Democratic operatives. And I think that, that the people who went to it aren't necessarily all horrible Democrats. I think it's people who oppose what Trump is doing. It was definitely a whiter crowd. And they had hands. I think it was offensive, though, because the taglines were hands off our bodies, hands off immigrants, hands off NATO, weirdly. I'm like, of all the things to care about right now. Hands off Social Security, hands off, okay, fine, yes, hands off of Social Security for sure. Immigrants, hands off Department of Education. Gaza wasn't mentioned, and the students having their visas revoked over Palestine was not mentioned. It's unbelievably offensive. It's literally the most cartoonish example of progressive except for Palestine. And so, yeah, I just found it really irritating and kind of outrageous, actually, that people can come out and protest, and they should protest what Trump is doing, but not say anything about a horrific genocide that's been going on for a year and a half.
Yeah, well, it's certainly the hands off NATO, I think, stood out to a lot of people. But what I will say is I guess it's one of these things that, sort of despite the best efforts of certain individuals, and I can't really speak to who that may be, who did not want Palestine to be mentioned, Palestine was actually pretty prominent in the April 5th protests across the country. In D.C., they actually did read a message from Mahmoud Khalil's wife, which I was told got huge cheers from the crowd. And all across sort of Palestinian-affiliated media, I was noticing on Sunday, people were posting the protests and saying people are protesting Trump in Palestine because people were bringing Palestinian flags. And in fact, I actually saw Gaza notifications, which I think is a great site. I'm not saying this to shade them at all in terms of what they bring to X and other places, but they actually mislabeled a protest that took place, I think, in Colorado as the pro-Palestine protest in D.C. because there were so many Palestinian flags flying at the protest in Colorado, and it was huge. Yeah. It was like not 100% clear who was who and what was what. Fox News actually got confused and said that the hands-off rally was organized by the People's Forum and the Palestinian Youth Movement because people were talking about Gaza. And I know in Durham, North Carolina, people actually printed out signs that said hands off Gaza and brought them out. So, I think it's among the masses of people who were coming out, it was something that was very palpably felt. But I think it speaks to the overall point you're making that the leadership of these entities and organizations, by keeping Palestine out, they were actually, against a lot of the people, probably the vast majority of them who were coming to their events, who would have loved to see Palestine lifted up in a bigger way and for Mahmoud Khalil to be discussed and all these other things. And I think it just shows that, in this moment and in this time, we're just in an extreme moment of contestation because everything is so up in the air and everything is so, it was like Chris Murphy, the senator who is like one of the most pro-imperialist senators, like also made that statement like Mahmoud Khalil should be released and we should, whatever, right? And like also talking about how we should be running like Bernie Sanders and all. It's just all these different sort of the tectonic plates are shifting in society. Like that, I think, is part of what Trump has done here by doing all these things. And so now it's really up for grabs. And I think, as you pointed out well, by describing all the different hands-offs, there's this huge frontal assault that's obviously all connected. It's obviously being done by all the same people, including the same people facilitating the genocide. So it's not like a fake thing to unite all of these issues. They are actually 100% united. And it's a question of, is there going to be a united fight back movement against these right-wing, reactionary, genocidal, militaristic policies? Like, let's also not forget this week that Trump, the peace president, says he wants a $1 trillion military budget. It's like, are we going to do that? Like, have a real strong, unified fight back? Or are the Democrats going to sheepdog people back into whatever? Like, someone sent me a video of Ro Khanna today, who's, trying to copy Bernie Sanders, going around and doing these events, these town halls all across the country. And it's a video, as they say, he's running. I mean, the guy's already positioning for 2028. But so a guy asked him a really great question, and he puts it in there, and he was like, why are the Democrats not doing anything? Like, you're the only Democrat here, so tell me why they're doing nothing. And he goes, no, you're right, da-da-da-da. And then he goes, the only thing we can do is organize in red districts. So, like, already saying the only solution is to win in the midterms, and, like, that will resolve things. And it's like, well, that's 2 years from now. Like, a lot's going to happen.
This is happening today, yeah.
So, like, what is your, like, should people strike? Like, you look at federal workers. Sorry, I'm going on and on now, but I saw something interesting last night. They've restored remote work at the FDA because so many people are either being fired or quitting. The entire FDA was about to collapse, like actually collapse. Wow. Like all inspections into food, into medicine, into everything was like gonna collapse. Horrible. So now they're telling people, okay, you can work from home, please don't quit. So like you can see, as much as Doge is saying we're gonna take a chainsaw to it, that federal workers have a lot of power because they are holding up critical services. So if federal workers went on strike, is Ro Khanna going to support them? It'd be an illegal wildcat strike. But he's not thinking about that. He's thinking about running for president and the midterms. So I think this is the state that we're in, where I think that it's good a lot of people came out, but it's contested territory, and it's really about who is going to lead this movement. Is it going to be like the people themselves that are angry about everything from Gaza to Social Security, or are we going to allow these interlopers, the Chris Murphys of the world, the Ro Khannas of the world? I actually would put a lot of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, of what he's a member in there. They ain't doing shit anyway. Sorry to say that, but it's all so fake. I mean, are we going to allow them to succeed? And it's like, I'm actually very happy to see the Bernie Sanders AOC rallies and that a ton of people are coming out. But realistically, they're not connecting them to local organizers, right? So these are the questions we have to start to ask and to start to press people on. So I think that's the distinction people have to make. Like, a lot of people are trying to take advantage of this moment and people's anger and pain and frustration and desire to fight back. And it's dumb, a lot of what they're doing, but people are angry and frustrated and have a desire to fight back. So can we contest at a higher level these sheepdog people who want to just, direct it back into the Democratic Party and make something out of this? I think that'll determine what happens over the next 2 years. Can we succeed on that front?
Also, it's missing the bigger issue, which is we're 3 months into this presidency. Just 3 months. And already look how much damage has been done. Right? And how much more is going to be done before we get to those midterms? How many more people are going to be put in ICE detention or deported to El Salvador to some prison labor camp for life, or disappeared, or have their families broken up, or be bombed, or on and on and on? It's so insane, or lose their life savings. And to have this kind of sheepdogging that you mentioned, it actually hurts us. It hurts us because it gets in the way of actually pushing back against essentially neo-fascists. What Democratic primary are you trying to run in when this guy wants to have a third term? You know what I mean? What are you trying to be a part of in power when he's attacking the courts? And we're losing the First Amendment. These are bigger issues than your career, than your stupid brand, than your stupid party that actually helped get us here. And it's pathetic. And it's just that cycle over and over again of ping pong between Democrats, Republicans. It just moves the country further to the right. But at some point, how much more right can you get? You just get a bunch of Hitlers. And then what? It's just...
Yeah. I mean, you put a fine point on it. Elon Musk, I pointed this out on the show yesterday with Brian that you mentioned about tariffs. I mean, his first statement against the tariffs was at the Lega meeting in Italy. So basically a fascist party. And we already saw the salute that he did. So yeah, I mean, at a certain point, you got to ask the question, as I keep trying to encourage people, you have to read the history of the abolitionist movement in America. They did not say, let's try to reform the Whig Party. They said, let's form a new party where we can unite all forces against slavery, take power, and end slavery. So we have to unite all the forces we can against this reactionary onslaught. But it has to be, it's the Democrats, they're like the Whigs. They are no longer actually an effective instrument. And progressive people, obviously the Republicans were never an instrument of progressive power in the past, 60 years. But the Democrats held themselves out to be. But if you're truly progressive, even if you're a Democrat, even if you voted for Kamala Harris, you have to recognize at this point, these people are not going to get it. And that together, I always point this out to people, and I'll close here. Trump did not even win 50% of the people who voted. He won 49 point something percent. He only won 33% basically of the voting age or eligible population. So this is a distinct minority movement. And we have to start to believe in ourselves that we do not need the Democratic Party high command to fight the far right. In fact, they are holding us back. And the power has to be taken back by the popular movements. And then I'll just say this before we go to our next guest. This is a total aside, but I learned it earlier this morning and I just want to put it on air since I mentioned Doge. They're saying they're going to end the phone appointments for people at Social Security. Well, 6 million seniors live 45 plus miles away from their closest Social Security office. So imagine how many senior citizens who use the phone to stay connected to their benefits, which for a number of senior citizens is their only income every month, may not even be able to go get assistance if there's any sort of problem, which means they could lose their benefits, which means they could lose their housing, not be able to eat, all these different things. And this is considered efficiency. I mean, it's honestly disgusting to see what these people are doing and what they're putting people through. But no, nonetheless, we can continue these themes in many different ways and many different times as we continue the show. But we want to move to the issue that I think has been a red thread running through the whole show today, as it often always is, which is the ongoing genocide in Palestine and some of the organizing that is going on around the issue of the military supply chain here. And we are very happy to be joined as we discuss this issue by Leah Kayali, who's an organizer with the Palestinian Youth Movement and their Mask Off Maersk campaign. Leah, thanks so much for being back with us.
Hi, Eugene. Hi, Rania. Thanks so much for having me.
Great to have you here. You know, Leah's my mom's name, so I was happy to have Leah on the show. You know, I want to start here. I know we talked about it before, but we've got a lot of new viewers since we've talked about the Mask Off Maersk campaign. I think a lot of people may not even know what Maersk is as an entity, since they don't know a lot about international shipping. I wouldn't blame them. So maybe just tell us a little something like what is and who is Maersk, and what in general is the campaign that you all have kicked off, PYM and your partners as well around them.
Sure, absolutely. So the Palestinian Youth Movement launched the Mask Off Maersk campaign at the People's Conference for Palestine last year. And for those who don't know, and I certainly didn't before we took on this campaign, AP Mahler Maersk is one of the largest corporations, the most profitable corporations in the world. They're a giant in the shippings and logistics industry, which means that they have a hand in shipping goods all around the world. And they're also deeply invested in the war profiteering supply chain, the supply chain for the genocide against our people in Palestine for the last 18 months. So Maersk has played one of the largest roles as a war profiteer, connecting actually all of the weapons manufacturers that folks have probably heard of, like Lockheed Martin, like Elbit Systems, like Raytheon. Maersk is shipping, millions of dollars worth of parts from these different companies, and also participates in programs like the Maritime Securities Program in the US that actually basically allows the US government to commandeer Maersk vessels to ship weapons components to their allies like Israel. So Maersk is playing a very direct role, which we uncovered even more so earlier in the fall when I think when I was last on the show, when we talked about the direct shipments of weapons components from the US to Israel through the port of Algeciras in Spain. And so what we found is that as we as a campaign are able to uncover our research of exactly how Maersk is complicit in the supply chain of death, Maersk is actually being forced to try to walk back their commitments, but also hide behind the fact that this is a large global supply chain, and they're also frankly lying about their involvement in the genocide. And so our campaign is going to continue to expose the ways in which Maersk is profiting off of the slaughter of our people, and we're going to continue to confront Maersk everywhere it goes.
I think this is so incredibly important because it's really like a campaign about material movement of weapons being used to carry out a genocide. And you can correct me if I'm wrong with some of these details, but when you talk about all these different countries whose ports this is going to, we're talking about weapons from Lockheed Martin in Texas making their ways to Israel's Navatim Air Base. And in order to do that, these ships have to go through so many countries. You mentioned Spain. We're also ports in France, Turkey, Morocco. So it's also countries that you can kind of go after here as well, which I think is super important. Also just crazy how many countries are complicit in this genocide, allowing their ports to be used for weapons to move, to go exterminate people. And sorry, I'm just kind of reiterating, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on any of that, or feel free to elaborate on some of those details, because I think it's important for people to understand this isn't just the Pentagon, shipping weapons to Israel and it's that simple. There are so many factors involved here. And this is just one shipping company you're going after. And it introduces so many ways that we can go after the different mechanisms that are involved in this genocidal network that allows Israel to continue to kill Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, to continue to bomb the entire region. But I guess from there, I just kind of want to ask, in terms of the countries involved, what is PYM, what is this campaign kind of doing in order to specifically go after countries that are allowing these ports to come through? Because some of these countries have laws on the books.
That's right, Rania. So like you mentioned, the F-35 supply chain is one of the latest developments in the campaign that our researchers from PYM and Declassified have been able to uncover the fact that this week and next week, Maersk will be shipping parts of F-35 with the fighter jets that drop bombs on the people of Gaza that have been directly causing the suffering of our people for a year and a half. The components of those fighter jets are being picked up by Maersk from a Lockheed Martin-run Air Force facility in Fort Worth, Texas. They're shipping through Norfolk, Virginia. Actually, earlier today, our organizers confronted that shipment in Norfolk, Virginia. There were over 100 people that had participated in that action, engaged workers at the dock in Norfolk who actually expressed a lot of solidarity with our folks. A lot of these, to your point about the vast network that is complicit in the supply chain of death, a lot of the workers who are actually embedded in these docks joined their job because they wanted to participate in the purveyance of life-saving supplies, not because they want to be shipping weapons of death. And so we've found that there's a lot of natural solidarity there. And then similarly, as this boat makes its way up, not just through the Port of Elizabeth, New Jersey, which it will be tomorrow, where people will again be confronting it, but past that through the Mediterranean, like you mentioned, Rania, it's going to be in Morocco, France, Spain, Turkey, and then eventually making its way to occupied Palestine. And so there is a natural base of solidarity in a lot of these places, especially the Arab countries like Morocco, where we've seen people take to the streets and confront the ports and confront Maersk time and again, and they will continue to do so. And I think this pressure is building in a lot of the countries in the Mediterranean, where they're realizing that either their leaders have been lying to them about how their nations are complicit in the genocide, or the difference between the will of the people and the behavior of the government and the corporations that are participating in this flow of weapons it's an untenable tension. And so I think what a lot of this campaign is sort of showing is that the natural feeling of people of conscience around the world to not want to participate in genocide is actually creating diplomatic crisis throughout, particularly the Mediterranean, but the world. And I think, it just goes to show the power of a people's arms embargo. When we take to the streets, when we make our our refusal to participate in the supply chain of death known, it's really going to be, causing crisis in the upper echelons of the ruling class in these countries.
No, I think it's such a great point, and obviously we have the historical example of South African apartheid, where this became a major issue in the middle of the 1980s, especially in the United States, actually, on the West Coast, the dock workers. So there's such a long history of people, and also the UK, I should add, of people around the world doing these kind of things to bring down similar sorts of regimes and governments. And you certainly speak to that if you'd like. Any reflections, I'd be curious. But I also just want to add on and ask you, I mean, it seems like this also speaks to the overall thought process, I think, of the average person, right? Which is kind of like, how are we actually going to stop this thing? And, I think a lot of times people are looking for kind of the magic key, but it's not necessarily about the magic key, but the multiplicity of different activities and actions. And I think the work that the Palestinian Youth Movement has done has shown this across, everything from protests to teach-ins to Mask Off Maersk. There's a cumulative effect to all these things if we really engage ourselves across the board.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Eugene. And I really think that at this point in our struggle as Palestinians, this is when we show what our organizing is for, right? Like, and it's not just about, like you said, the Mask Off Maersk campaign and actually confronting the supply chain of death itself, but it's about the full picture of the movement. It's about explaining to people why it is that we organize. It's, you know, it's the full fabric, the tapestry of organized people, the confrontation of Zionism, the refusal of the people by taking to the streets in mass protests, the sharpening of consciousness of people through teach-ins and things of that nature, and also the protection of our movement at a time of unprecedented, you know, crackdown. We're seeing, you know, obviously Trump trying to scare the movement for Palestinian liberation into silence because, frankly, they see this movement and the cross movement, you know, front that we've developed in this country as a threat. And Trump should be threatened by our movement, right? Because the reality is that people who are watching this genocide unfold and who know that they don't want to be a part of it are also realizing that the ruling class that is enabling this mass slaughter of Palestinians is also is doing so at their own expense. I heard, you know, on the show you were earlier talking about, you know, people being deprived of Social Security, the gutting of the federal government and the you know, what little protections it gives people in their daily lives in the US. All of these things are connected, and our movement in kind must, you know, connect to these threads and connect people through you know, diversity of actions and tactics, through the everything from the mass protests to the confrontation of the supply chain directly, to defending our people who, you know, the students that are being abducted, our immigrant neighbors who are being deported. This is where we show what we organize for. And I think that that's really coming through.
And with all that in mind, I'm curious your general thoughts about this meeting between Netanyahu and Trump this week, and these ongoing comments from Donald Trump about pushing for Palestinians to leave Gaza. He said he made some comments again about that, and they seem to really be trying to push for that plan. No aid has been allowed into Gaza for the last month. Intentionally so by the Israelis. Their genocide has seemed to, you know, reach a new point of intensity. In a sense, the Israelis seem like they're in finish the job mode. At least it's how they're speaking. So yeah, I'm just curious, you know, what you think all that means a year and a half into this.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, you know, Zionists have claimed that they're finishing the job since 1948, and Palestinian resistance has endured and fought back for, you know, the 77 years since, coming on 77 years of Nakba. I do think we need to continue to keep a spotlight and a megaphone on what's happening in Gaza. Every day, you know, dozens, if not hundreds of people are massacred by the US-backed Zionist regime. And that has only escalated since Israel broke the ceasefire, you know, earlier this spring. But when Trump talks about, you know, ethnically cleansing Gaza, finishing the job, I think we as Palestinians know that, you know, our struggle is a long one. We are connected to our land, and Palestinians in Gaza and throughout Palestine are not going anywhere, and will continue to fight to remain on their land and for the refugees for the right to return. I think as this rhetoric continues, we're also seeing the weakenings of within empire, right? Like, I think the cracks in empire are actually also widening in this moment. You know, I think while we know that Trump and Netanyahu are, you know, deep in bed with each other, we also have seen some tensions rise in this most recent meeting. Netanyahu wanting Trump to call off the tariffs, and he didn't get that out of the meeting. There's some tension over the US's, you know, talks with Iran, and I think that this is really indicating that as empire gets more and more gluttonous in its attempt to stifle the revolution of the people, it's also, you know, that's when the chains in the link of empire's armor are widening and eroding, and that's when we as a people's movement strike, right? That's when we you know, really tighten our organizing and advance our campaigns, when we show people that what it is that these governments are really doing, and that we can provide, you know, an alternative that is something different than endless genocide, endless, you know, wars that the US has been involved in, and endless erosion of our own livelihoods here in the US. And so I really do think that, on the one hand, things do look quite dark right now in Gaza, and it's incumbent on us to keep a spotlight on that and to continue organizing at the, amplifying at the loudest volumes what's happening. It's also important for us to understand the moment that we're in and the weakening of empire in some ways, as its, greed is really escalating. So I think that there's sort of both sides of that in this most recent meeting.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's always darkest before the dawn, as they say. Quickly, before we let you go, Leah, how can people find out more about the Mask Off Maersk campaign, and if they so choose, get involved?
Yeah, great question. People can follow us on Instagram and check out our website. You'll see that we'll, release when we uncover things about the supply chain and where Maersk is headed, what, the latest sort of war profiteering that's lining their pockets is. We'll let people know about actions at the ports and how to get involved, how to join our global network of people that are planning to confront Maersk everywhere they are. The thing about this target is that Maersk is everywhere. Like I said at the top, it's one of the largest corporations in the world, and therefore we can be everywhere too in confronting it. So really encourage folks to check out our Instagram and the website and get plugged in and organize, wherever you are.
Right on. Leah Kayali with the Palestinian Youth Movement, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm. Rania?
Well, Eugene, I am very glad that there is research being done into these networks of death, and that people are responding to it in real time as this ship makes its way. That's incredible to see happening. And sometimes I think we were talking about this last week, but there's this attitude of what's the point? It hasn't worked yet. And it's these things take time. These campaigns take time. Protest takes time. And it's just one part of a multi-pronged strategy to push back against this hell.
Yeah, and it's we did talk about this last week, and somebody put something in my mentions on social media. I wish I could remember the exact phrasing, but I thought it was a good phrase. They were like, it's not the last blow that breaks the rock, but the hundreds of blows before. You know what I mean? It takes a second sometimes, and you never know exactly when you're going to break through, and you never know when different contradictions are going to start to add. I mean, I made that point earlier about Israel Katz. I think that's his name, the foreign minister. Of Israel, saying there's no shortages. And, there's a lot of reasons why he might be saying that. But I think one major reason is they're concerned about the situation in the United Kingdom, because this has become a big issue in Parliament, because obviously there are millions of people in the UK. But it's become a big issue in Parliament because you have to look a little bit below the surface. The Labour Party is taking all these losses. That's the ruling party. But you have, in different areas where a lot of people care about Palestine, they had independents beat Labour candidates in the last election. But now in all these by-elections in what's the equivalent in America of the city council, you see these independents who one of their main issues is Gaza just keep winning. And I've been noticing the slight changes in these cowardly people like David Lammy, the foreign minister of the UK, and the people during Question Time. I mean, just cowardly war criminal adjacent facilitator. I mean, the worst people in Keir Starmer's government. But, you got to look at the cracks. They keep saying about this, there should be no blockade, there should be none of this, and that it's right on the edge of breaking international law. Now, of course, they're well past that, but you can see even for these warmonger, pro-genocide people in the Labour Party, they're obviously starting to get a little concerned. Their heat is starting to get a little hot under their seat. They're worried about their own positions of power, privilege, and influence because they see people in the UK are getting angrier and angrier and angrier. They're seeing that the Fillington 18, who took action against Elbit Systems by driving that truck, at least allegedly, into a weapons facility, are getting a huge amount of support. The fact that Holocaust survivors are being questioned by the police for laying a wreath for the children killed in Gaza. This is actually really happening in the UK, that this could actually seriously dent them. So, here they are. So I'm sure in Israel, they're thinking, well, we better actually try to lie more because, maybe we could lose the UK aid, and we don't want that, and it seems like things like this could never happen. But people thought apartheid would never fall either. You know what I mean? And everyone thought that it was going to go on, and the U.S. is supporting them, the U.K. is supporting them. Thatcher and Reagan are 100% for apartheid. They'll never end it. They'll never stop it. And things did start to change. So I think that a lot of times we don't see everything that's happening, and it seems like change isn't happening and things aren't stopping. But it's this continual buildup of incremental actions, activities, contradictions, and other things that bring down systems. And we have to keep acting. It's always better to be active than inactive. And I think that's the thing. They want you to stay home. They want you to do nothing. They want you to be discouraged. Like, that is what they want, because, no matter what it is, the more activity there is in solidarity with the Palestinian people, the better it is. And they know that the more people know about this, the harder it will be for them. A new poll even came out today. The vast majority of people in the United States do not support Trump's plan in Gaza. Right? A majority of people have an unfavorable view of Israel, which is like unprecedented in the United States. So to them, the protests and all that kind of stuff, that's why they're going after people. That's why they're going after Mahmoud Khalil. That's why they're saying, that the People's Forum in New York is a terrorist organization. People like Marco Rubio saying that, obviously totally false. Like, if the protest didn't matter, why would they be doing this? Why would they be arresting people, smearing people, trying to take them down, trying to destroy organizations, people suing people, trying to get their nonprofit status ripped away? Like, why would they do any of that if it didn't matter? And I think so when you hear people say it didn't matter, there are some people who are good people who are just frustrated saying that because they're angry and they want to see more happen, and I understand that. But as I've said before in the show, and as I said about this issue before April 5th, we have to be very careful about this, because the people who don't want you to do anything are the people committing the genocide. The people who want all the protests to stop and are actually blackmailing every major American university in, like, every Harvard, MIT, Northwestern, Penn, like, they're blackmailing the Ivy League and every top 20 university in America because they are afraid of the protest. They are afraid of the shift of public opinion. They are afraid of the fact that more and more people are in favor of Palestine. You look at Malaysia and Indonesia, and I know I'm on a rant, but I'm just going to say it because here we are. There was an interesting poll that was done last year in 2024. And it was compared to 2023 prior to October 7th. And they asked people in Indonesia and Malaysia, they said, if you had to choose, would you prefer your country to be in an alliance with China or the United States? Now, already a majority of people in Malaysia and Indonesia had said China. But in both countries, the number of people who said China went up 10%. Now, I don't really know what else was happening between 2023 and 2024, but given the fact that Palestine solidarity is huge in both those countries, Malaysia and Indonesia, it seems like what happened is 10% of two of the most geostrategically important countries for the United States strategy of isolating and destroying China actually have moved into the camp of, we got to work with China instead of the United States because the U.S. is a crazy, insane, genocidal warmonger that we cannot trust. Like, those are big changes and big differences and things that they fear. The Houthis have shut down the whole Red Sea, and they're bombing them like crazy, and it's not stopping. So, they're worried about what's happening, whether we're talking about small protests, small teach-ins, what's happening in the Red Sea, what's happening in Southeast Asia, and honestly, the fact that they haven't been able to destroy the Palestinian resistance in Gaza, despite the most unbelievable offensive of all time against humanity. I mean, it's crazy. So anyway, I just want to say all that because I understand people getting down and being frustrated and being upset, but demobilization is not the answer. And people saying, don't do this, don't do that, you're either really off base and helping the enemy, or you are the enemy. You are in favor, actually, and you're pretending to be someone who you aren't in order to manipulate people. And look, just Google COINTELPRO. That stuff is real, and we can't just deny it when we're in an inflection point moment. So anyway, I'll just leave it there.
No, I think that's very well said. I appreciate all that, and I think people need to hear it, and we will keep saying it here on Breakthrough News as long as you keep supporting Breakthrough News. And with that, I will add, become a member of Breakthrough News for as little as $5 a month at patreon.com/Breakthrough News, where you can access exclusive content as well as exclusive merch. Like, we forgot to show the mugs, so
yes.
Back, you've reunited with my mug. I added a little straw. But,
nice.
That doesn't come with the mug. You have to get your own straw. Yeah. Thank you. I try to stay classy here, folks. But please do become a member of Breakthrough News. We are an independent media outlet. We are able to bring you all of the coverage of the movement. Movies like The Encampments, which if you have not seen, go to the-encampments.com and go get tickets to see The Encampments. Incredible movie produced by Breakthrough News, by Watermelon Pictures, executive produced by Macklemore. Excuse me. sets the record straight about what happened at those campus encampments. It's a bit redundant. Last year, and features prominently Mahmoud Khalil, who's now in ICE detention. And the more people who go see it, the longer it stays in theaters. But we are able to create content like that, movies like that, documentary film, shows like Dispatches that I host, shows like this one with me and Eugene, the Freedom Side Live, bring you the Socialist Program every Wednesday, the China Report, and so much more because of your support. So sorry, I'm moving between websites here, but patreon.com/breakthrough news. And also make sure you smash that like button if you haven't already. It helps. Button. Beautiful. Love the cheers at the end, honestly. Makes me feel good. But it helps boost us in the algorithm. It's really important that you make sure you engage with our content on YouTube, on Instagram, on Twitter, because we're working against an algorithm that is meant to boost CNN and suppress us.
Yes, 100%. Well, look, I couldn't say it any better. I'll just say, please also check out the great interview you did with the director of The Teacher, also a Watermelon Films production. Here's my advice to you if you want to do something this weekend. Go see the encampments and go see The Teacher, and let's blow out every movie theater in the United States with pro-Palestine content that is well professionally made, telling critically important stories, both real-life stories, documentary stories, and also real-life stories, but told in a fictional, novelistic way, but in a way that really speaks to the reality of Palestinian people on the ground in the West Bank. Go see the encampments, go see The Teacher. Let's show that there really are millions of people in this country who are going to put our money where our mouth is and support the people and the organizations and those stories that are really helping to move the needle and move the narrative against this genocide. So I think I'll just close it there for myself, for Rania, for our whole Breakthrough News team. We will see you next time.